Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the April edition of the Door County Maritime Speaker Series. This evening, April 8th, 2021. Thanks to our sponsor, Door County Medical Center, for making this possible, this series. We ask that you keep your video off and your microphones muted. That helps with our bandwidth and it helps everybody. And as we go along, if you've got questions, please type them into the chat. And we will answer them at the end of Rhys's presentation. Just because of the way we're set up tonight, we can't really do that as we go along. And at the end, we'll have time to engage in conversation with Rhys. You can ask him all kinds of interesting questions. But before we begin, if you would, set yourself a reminder, mark your calendar for our May 6th speaker series. Next month, we are welcoming Harvey Moshman and Brian Callies as they share with you their documentary, Heroes on Deck, which is about the aircraft carriers and pilot training that took place on Lake Michigan during World War II. It's really interesting. I'm really excited to share this documentary with you. So without further ado, I present to you Door County Maritime Museum's curator, Mr. Rhys Kuzdas, to enthrall you with stories about this contentious box behind me.
Hello, my name is Rhys Kuzdas. I'm curator here at the Door County Maritime Museum. I am hoping that you are seeing the slideshow that I currently have up. What I am here to talk to you about, of course, is the Safeway shipping container here. But more importantly, the story of how it was kind of forgotten and lost, and how there have been many claims to legacies related to commercial shipping that I think need to be explored. So with further ado, I'm going to start us up with a similar tale. Who invented the telephone? Many of you might immediately answer Alexander Graham Bell. He was certainly awarded the first United States patent on February 14th, 1876 for the talking telegraph. The main argument for his claim to fame for a century was that what was the measure that we would take? Official recognition by the state and public, and he certainly had the legal patent, plenty of press, and the ability to commercialize his product. But what about Antonio Meucci? He was a poor Italian immigrant who started his designs all the way back in 1849 and had filed a caveat towards his invention of the teletrofona in 1871. And had it not been for the lack of funds allowing for him to extend the caveat, he would likely have gotten his patent several years earlier than Bell. In fact, his working models were actually stored and subsequently lost in the exact same Western Union lab that Alexander Bell built his model. The patent award to Bell was challenged and fought in the courts for over a decade afterwards. However, after Meucci's death in 1887, the whole issue was pretty much considered moot, and Bell was allowed to keep his patent and, by extension, his claim to the title of inventor of the telephone. However, while the courts seemed to settle on the matter, history did not. Many great American inventors, like Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell, have undergone greater scrutiny in the last few decades. And on June 11th, 2002, the House of Representatives even passed a resolution honoring Meucci for his work and highlighting the perceived injustice of his obscurity. However, the question remains, who invented the telephone? The man who came up with the idea, the design, and the prototype? Or the man who commercialized a prototype? Telephones are ubiquitous with modern life. While the technology has evolved significantly since the 19th century, the ability to directly communicate with one another with the simple press of a few buttons really did change everything. Also ubiquitous, if perhaps not as well understood to the average person, are shipping containers. Yes, the boring boxes of corrugated steel that are literally everywhere. Most people alive today have grown up seeing these large boxes of steel everywhere. Whether they are slowly going by on an intersection, delaying you while you're waiting for traffic, as a train goes by, or on board a ship getting getting itself jammed into a canal, or even being repurposed as houses now. You see them pretty much everywhere. The fact that they are also a very recent innovation in commercial shipping is often lost by their omnipresence. In fact, they have essentially faded into the background as just a matter of fact of every day. So who is responsible for this? Who invented the shipping container? Well, let's see what the Wall Street Journal has to say about that matter.
We're not getting sound.
Is there some difficulty with the sound right now?
We hear you.
We can hear you, but we're not getting the sound out of the video.
All right. Well, then what I will do is, unfortunately, we will just go with subtitles.
Ah, good.
Thank you. right.
Sorry about the technical issue there with the sound. You know, we're still new to our streaming of demonstrations here. So the inventor of the shipping container, as the video just told you, well, obviously that was American businessman Malcolm McLean. He designed it, built it, and sailed shipping containers in 1956, and was awarded a patent in 1958. Case is closed. I'm pretty much done here. Thanks for coming to the presentation. Questions been answered. It's all good, right? Bad joke, I know. He did get the patent. He did build it, and he commercialized by selling them and putting them on ships. And of course, he got all the press and prestige that went along with that. Simple, right? Maybe not. Maybe it's a little more complicated than just one man who came at the end of the process. Well, the Fruhoff Trailer Company also claims that their own vice president of engineering, Keith Tatlinger, was the actual creator and designer when they designed the units through the 1950s. Later, that company manufactured and sold the units to McLean's Sea and Land Service. And it can be argued that McLean's Sea and Land Service, and it can be argued that maybe this is just semantics. I mean, after all, Tatlinger and McLean were just the flip sides of the same coin, right? Sure, McLean did not actually design and build it together, you know, himself, but you know, they worked together as partners. You know, they were surely the first in all categories, right? Well, it even gets a little further complicated now. To knock a hole in that claim, one only needs to go back to about a decade prior. The notion of using containers to ship goods across water was the solution that the United States Army and Transportation Corps came up with to protect its large shipments of ammunition. In 1947, they developed, quote, transporters, loading ships to steel boxes off trucks and trains for transportation to ports. A system that was used to supply the Korean Peninsula during the Korean War. And what if we even go further back and consider the relatively obscure Benjamin Franklin Fitch, who can largely be considered the father of containerization, or the process of putting goods in containers to be shipped elsewhere. He's considered the father of that process here in the United States. His patents stretch back to 1922, and his intermodal system, otherwise the ability to move from one mode of transportation to another mode of transportation seamlessly, in this case, from like a rail car to a truck bed. His intermodal system laid the groundwork for connecting road and rail into one standardized shipping system. Even his design for a 20-foot steel container could easily be confused for the ones that we use today. So really, it depends on how you define the question. And the way you might define it, he could very well be argued to be the true inventor of the shipping container. But that's actually kind of a good point. Let's consider how we determine the claim to the person who invented the first shipping container or the person who invented modern commercial shipping. Let's define that question and its application in the modern system. Obviously, there is the container itself, right? The box, the metal box. But then there's also kind of the system of utilizing containers to ship goods from point A to point B. Now, there have been boxes used since time immemorial to package and ship goods. But we're kind of trying to define it down to what a shipping container would be. And in order to kind of rate those potential claims on who actually helped kind of create this, lay this groundwork, who invented it, whether they were the most successful at it or not. So our criteria for looking at this claim is, one, the container had to have existed, right? It couldn't just be a drawing on a piece of paper. It had to have actually been created in the real world. We can apply the standard of patenting as well. we could say, the legal authority says that you invented that. Now, that might not necessarily be the best way to rate it, but it's one method we can do that. A shipping container, we also realized in this system, had to be standardized. Every shipping container had to be the same. It had to be able to be put on different kind of modes of transportation. It had to be able to, fit together just fine. And so it was very important that each container, in this category, is the same. They had to be reusable. The entire concept of a shipping container, a container system, is that you can just reuse the same container over and over again. Otherwise, you could just wrap whatever you want in and call it a shipping container. You could wrap something in paper and call it a shipping container. Well, technically, that might be accurate. In the case of our system here, we're looking at the ability to create it and reuse it. And now this isn't a necessity, but I think a lot of people would qualify this as the ability to stack, the ability to actually condense and go vertical. So that's the container. That's what we're looking at. Who made that first container? Now there's the second. There's the actual system of the process of shipping a good from A to B. A shipping container, and what we're looking at, the modern shipping container, had to be intermodal. It had to be able to be put on a train. It had to be able to be put on a truck. It had to be able to be put on a ship. Specifically for our category, they needed to be directly loaded on or off ships. The shipping container is pointless in our context if you have to unload everything from the shipping container and load it back up on the ship. We're trying to avoid that. It needed to be able to be transported over water, obviously tied to the ability to put on ships. We're also then looking to see whoever made the system, was there investment in it? Did people buy into it? Might have invented the container, but it's kind of pointless if nobody's using it, right? So it was purchased, and more importantly, it was commercially used. We're looking for a shipping container that was filled with goods and shipped. I feel like that would be probably the ultimate testament on the claim to having invented this kind of system. So really, what we're looking for then is the person or the individual or the company or whoever was able to check all these boxes, and most importantly, to have done it first. Because you can't claim to invent something if somebody already did it for you. So with all these in mind, and I've already thrown out a bunch of names, let's go ahead and go back and take a look at the beginning. Let's go back and really investigate the whole process of how we came to this point. The problem inherent to loading ships has not been a recent dilemma. There were attempts at standardizing containers and the ships that hauled those centuries before the advent of any shipping container. Archaic sounding terms like bushel, cord, bale, peck were well known in yesteryear because they represented common methods and means of shipping. One significant leftover of this can be seen in the imperial measuring standard used in the United States today. The term tonnage has been historically used to describe both weight and volume for a ship and its cargo. Originally, the term came from the English tun, T-U-N, which was a large cask that was used to ship wine and other liquids. The ton had a volume of 954 liters, or 252 gallons for everybody from America here, when filled, and had a total weight of about 1,016 kilograms, or 2,240 pounds. As wine was shipped widely, and it was one of the few containers with a common measurement, it eventually became standard. The ton was widely adopted throughout the world, for measuring weight and eventually converting to the metric ton, 1,000 kilograms. And of course, then the imperial long ton, which is 2,240 pounds, and the short ton, 2,000 pounds. Today's tonnage is still used. Today, tonnage is still used to describe the volume of cargo spaces of a ship, such as net tonnage, or the entire volume of a ship, the gross tonnage. And while there's been in existence intermodal box containers since similar to what we consider a shipping container today, in the late 19th and early 20th century in both Europe and America, these tended to be directly tied to the rail system. The first railway container hub opened up in Enola, Pennsylvania, pioneered by none other than the aforementioned Benjamin Fitch. And that was opened by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company in 1932. Now, these earlier cars were primarily built of wood and iron to varying sizes and shapes. And these containers could be lifted to switch between rail cars or onto trucks, but ultimately would have proved very unsuitable for use with ships. Different railroad companies adopted different design parameters, and the standardization was still in its infancy. That meant that a rail car might deliver a container to the dock. Then it had to be unloaded by hand before the cargo was transferred again back to the ship. Something would have to happen that would reshape the entire landscape and create an increased need for international shipping. Let's see here. But let's actually go back here for a second, because I want to talk about the work that was involved with this. It wasn't just as simple as it took a long time and it was costly. Prior to the advent of containerization, the method of cargo transportation was pretty much an eclectic affair. While bulk industrial products like coal, ore, and stone are still shipped in the massive holds of freighters, commercial goods were often required their own special form of packaging. An entire industry was built around making and filling these customized containers, whether that be a barrel of molasses, a bag of coffee, or a box of radios. Each item had to be loaded, stowed, and unloaded by hand in often very differently designed ship holds. These were handled by teams of dockyard workers that went by many different names, including such as stevedores, dockers, and longshoremen. No matter the name, though, these dockyard workers' sole job was to load and unload cargo. These jobs were very brutal and demanding, even into the 20th century. The task was almost exclusively performed by the disenfranchised and poor in society. Prior to 1865 in the United States, slaves were used extensively. And even following their emancipation, it was one of the few areas of labor that were available to Black Americans. Wages were not much better for northern ports where old world immigrants fresh off the boat could find themselves working to very much load up the next one. Strikes and the commercial pain that they could cause were common, and the plight of the dockyard worker was commonly used as an argument for unionization and labor rights. Ironically, this unskilled labor actually required a lot of skill. And one of the reasons why Teamster and dockyard workers were so effectively able to unionize during the early 1900s was due to the complexity and absolute necessity of doing this physically demanding yet technically challenging labor. If the longshoremen and the stevedores did not load your ship could not go. It could not deliver its goods. Your perishable products would rot at the dock, and you would lose money if you were a ship owner. So moving back forward again to what I was originally talking about, which was what would change this landscape. And that would probably most likely have been World War II. The transportation needs of World War II, with its far-flung theaters and the massive quantities of goods and materials needed to support it, were a logistical challenge really never before seen in history. A lot of attention is placed on the events of the battle spot and on the factory floors of the home front. However, the hero most hidden were those moving supplies from point A to point B. Shipbuilders, transportation workers, dockyard workers, merchant mariners, and the supply corps of all the various branches all had to work together in order to get even a single bullet, a single truck, or even just a single pat of butter to the other side. Thousands of freighters, tenders, and other ships across dozens of yards were built to exact specifications to suit their roles and their cargoes. This represented a significant leap forward into the standardization of shipping and methodology for shipping. By the time the war had turned towards the Allies' favor, there were already expectations that the post-war landscape with Europe and Asia in tatters would lead to an economic boom for the United States, which had retained and expanded its transport capacity through the war. Both of these factors had many shipping companies eager to capitalize on this bounty of goods, much at the expense of everybody else, and left to a significant impression on one local Wisconsin shipbuilding company about the future of this transportation. To say that Lethem D. Smith was a force in the Great Lakes would be an understatement. Lethem D. Smith, born September 7th, 1886, right here in Sturgeon Bay, had been raised from a child in all aspects of the stone and transport business that his father, Thomas Smith, had built. By the turn of the century, he was already trying to find means necessary to improve his father's substantial yet slowly declining holdings. He enrolled and graduated from the University of Wisconsin with a degree in civil engineering in 1909, attempting to bring his knowledge to the business and exert his own vision, his own direction. And this education would actually become kind of a point of bitter contention with his father, who himself had largely succeeded and built his businesses in spite of not being educated at the college level. He built his first tug, Lethem D. Smith, the John Hunsatter, largely without his father's help. This, combined with the capital he acquired from salvaging the steamship Panther in 1911, allowed him to purchase a quarter interest in his father's company. Nothing was just given freely. As foreshadowing of his later interest in shipping innovation, he converted the large freighter Adriatic into one of the Great Lakes' first self-unloading vessels. After the death of his father, Thomas Smith, the young Lethem accumulated his father's business and ran with it, renaming it several times and expanding it into other areas, particularly stone. During the 1920s, he continued to patent and invent new transportation methods for bulk goods, including the first scrapper-type cell phone loader that he personally installed on the freighter Fontana. Lethem D. Smith was able to actually navigate through the Great Depression, barely holding on to his shipyard and his fortunes by the skin of his teeth. In fact, he came very, very close to liquidation in 1933. His luck changed when he was able to take advantage of the onset of World War II in the forms of the naval contracts and army contracts that were coming in that allowed him to expand his business. It wasn't long until he had created an economic powerhouse, producing freighters, transports, sub-chasers at breakneck speed. At one point, the Lethem D. Smith Shipbuilding Company had over 7,000 people working at their yards in some capacity, or were supplying goods and skills and services to his shipyard. By 1944, Lethem D. Smith had built one of the largest shipyards in the Great Lakes, but its success was built primarily upon his naval contracts. With the war quickly ending, those contracts were going to evaporate, and so a transition needed to occur. Now, it was obvious that the United States was going to leave the war in a very favorable position, as I mentioned before. It was essentially going to become an economic powerhouse that would be able to ship its goods to all corners of the war-ravaged globe. He also witnessed, Lethem D. Smith did, during his time building up his own company, how the cost of loading and transporting goods has strangled the shipping businesses of the late 1800s, early 1900s out of the Great Lakes. Trains could simply deliver manufactured goods at a cheaper rate. And so many freighters went further and further towards either being regulated to shipping bulk cargoes, like grains or coal or stone or ore, or just actually physically transporting the rail cars themselves. If there was a way that one could take the container system currently in place in rail and reinvent that, along with building a new kind of ship that could actually haul these containers itself, well, the potentials were limitless, not only for the Great Lakes, but for the entire world. So, a small team of designers was assembled in 1944. Howard Hunt, the former plate steel intendant, was placed in charge of production. Others involved included Henry King, Richard A. Stern, Elton Washburn, and Carl Christensen, who himself would actually go on later to create the Christie Corporation. They all worked through the waning months of World War II to create and to create a solution to solve the dilemma put forward by Lethem. He tasked them to find a way to reduce the high cost of freight handling and its root causes by having to source shipments, the long load times associated with that, and of course, the potential shortage or loss and theft caused by damage getting damaged or stolen. Smith wanted a container that could be packaged, they could package many different kinds of freight, could be loaded by the shipping company at their plant, and then locked and sealed to prevent loss. They needed to be able to be moved around easily, stacked to maximize the ability to transport them, and strong enough to withstand the rigors of handling. He also envisioned a new kind of freighter, not too dissimilar to many of the naval designs that he had pretty much been ordered to construct during the war, with an expanded hold specifically designed for carrying the units. And ideally would have some kind of mechanism to actually remove the units itself. That way it wouldn't have to always rely on the dock to move goods on or off. As these containers would then be handled by crane, it would greatly reduce the amount of backbreaking manual labor required by those stevedores and longshoremen, which most importantly for Lethem D. Smith and other commercial shippers was the cost. It wasn't so much some humanitarian gesture as it was to kind of maximize the input into their pocketbooks. Consideration was also taken on what was going to happen after offloading. By tailoring the design to rail and railroad standards, or railroad and road standards, then you would be able to actually use these self-unloaders to transfer the contents directly from the railroad cars or trucks to the ships and back again. This would be a vast improvement over the existing system, which required repackaging contents for different kinds of transportation. Containers would be numbered and sealed so they could be more easily tracked via logistics, and loss would, of course, then be further mitigated. With these parameters set, the LDS team set out to create an entirely new system of commercial transportation. Studies were made to determine the best approach to the design, keeping them large enough so that the greatest percentage of packages could be stored in them, and keeping their cost of handling at a minimum at warehouse and ships. The eventual design agreed upon followed the same dimensions of the existing railway container of the New York Central Railroad. The first standardized shipping container and delivery system, known as the Safeway container, was designed and built at the Lethem D. Smith Shipbuilding Company in 1945. The dimensions of the box would provide floor area of 7 feet by 9 feet and a height of about 7.5 feet, which would then be suitable for transportation by rail anywhere in the country. These units were also made to be completely collapsible so that when not carrying their cargo, the units were able to squeeze in on itself, as you can see in that image right there, to save space. Each container was designed of steel frames with either linings of plywood or metal, depending on the needs, and of course, a steel or aluminum shell. The shell would be painted, of course, to prevent corrosion. The legs were added to the bottom of the Safeway container that they could then fit into the grooves molded into the top of each unit. This allowed easy access for forklift or crane, as well as to lift, but also more importantly, this allowed them to be stacked and locked together. Kind of in a format similar to Legos. The structural load of the containers allowed them to be stacked 4 high and still maintain their strength. The patent application was filed in October 1946, being awarded in January 1949. In conjunction with the containers they designed, they created they set out to create an entirely new type of ship designed for the Great Lakes that could also easily navigate the seaway into the Atlantic for cross-oceanic travel. The major innovation of these ships was the integration of overhead traveling cranes and fully accessible holds specifically designed to accommodate the containers. These cranes would facilitate the rapid loading and discharging of the containers, as well as completely negate the need for the wasteful and time-consuming process of strapping, fastening, and just otherwise securing individual boxes and containers. The ship was designed with large hatches using a large steel plate gasketed cover and reinforced with double hulls to allow to strengthen the entire vessel. Designed specifically with the way containers would alter the seaworthiness of a vessel in mind. The hold would be 2 containers deep and still be seaworthy with another 2 containers above the deck, making it feasible to transport those 4 tiers of containers on the vessel while still be able to maximize the space. It was estimated that fully loaded, each container could hold about 8 tons of goods, and about 660 containers could be discharged out of the ship in an equal number, then loaded in about 16 hours at a substantial cost savings. The first prototype was completed and demonstrated early in 1945. Shortly thereafter, in June of that same year, the Safeway Container Division of the Leith D. Smith Shipbuilding Company was awarded a contract by the Agwilanese Steamship Company, later known as the Ward Line of New York, for their cargo ships to and from the Caribbean. The first shipment of Safeway containers, 5 rigid and 20 collapsible, as well as 2 lifting hoist locks, things that would actually be able to allow them to carry them, were shipped out September with preparations being made for repeat orders. They were put to the test later, and the first shipment of goods utilizing the new system occurred in October 1945. Safeway containers were used to ship a full cargo, including a load of rum from Puerto Rico to New York. It arrived without a single broken or lost bottle. Not only did this beat that first container shipment made by McLean by over a decade, it was also the first container shipment between 2 ports that weren't on the same landmass. Unfortunately, Leith D. Smith would not live long enough to see the seeds of his new venture bear fruit. On June 23rd, 1946, he drowned along with 3 others when his sloop, the Half Moon, sank in a sudden squall in Green Bay. One of the casualties also included Elton Washburn, who was his head of Safeway Container Production, Howard Hunt, as well as his head of Safeway Container Production. This left the controlling stake of the Leith D. Smith Shipbuilding Company and its future, and the future of Safeway Containers, in the hands of the newly widowed Anna Smith, Leith D. Smith's wife. The management staff of the Smith Company pushed for continued operation, as the financial future of the company was bright. They were still in the process of completing orders. They were expanding their commercial shipping ventures, and by all measure, it was on stable setting. Whatever her reasoning, though, the widow Smith pushed for the complete liquidation of the company, which would then close its door upon completion of its last contracts. Holding a winning and proven system, the Drayville Corporation of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was approached to purchase the licensing rights of the Safeway Container. They accepted the offer, and 1 month after notifying their intentions to purchase the business, the Leith D. Smith Shipbuilding Company disclosed its customer lists, blueprints, profit figures, and all records contained with the container wing to the Drayville Corporation, essentially ceding all of their secrets, all of their information to what was at one point a former rival, and now their customer. What should have been a very straightforward exchange was upended in an unexpected turn of results. Rejecting the previous agreement, Drayville decided not to purchase the business, and instead immediately began producing shipping containers of their own design. Taken aback by what was clearly a case of theft of trade secrets, Drayville Corporation was notified of a breach of confidential relationship and patent infringement on January 14th, 1949. This case would eventually escalate up to the 7th Circuit Court, and it wasn't until 1954 that the lawsuit was finally resolved in Leith D. Smith Shipbuilding Company's favor. The Drayville Corporation entered into a 10-year agreement to pay royalties to Leith D. Smith Shipbuilding Company for their container design. However, by that time, that victory was pretty much hollow. After all, it was all but moot. The Leith D. Smith Shipbuilding Company had long been sold. The Safeway Container Division ceased to exist ages ago, practically almost nearly a decade ago. The Drayville Corporation itself would find itself later to be acquired by the Karamusik Corporation in 1998, and the ruling of Smith versus Drayville is still used in case law as a classic example of trade secret violation. So going back to our list here, checking our boxes, right? The Safeway shipping container story clearly shows that not only did Lethem D. Smith and the employees of the Lethem D. Smith Shipbuilding Company design the shipping container, one, it existed. They were able to patent it. They standardized it. It was reusable, and personally, I think very important, it was stackable. They were able to demonstrate and use it on open water. It was an intermodal system, directly loaded onto ships. They were able to move goods from Puerto Rico to New York without breaking that single bottle. It was a purchased product, and it was commercially used. It was commercially viable. It existed, and it existed in a fashion that preceded McLean's own claim by a decade. In other words, it hits all the prerequisites of the claim. Though there is another question that I haven't really addressed in all this, and that is, does it really matter which single individual gets the credit of inventing something? After all, something as complex as the infrastructure of modern shipbuilding is built upon thousands and thousands of small improvements over decades and centuries. All of that has just pushed us to where we are today. Was the shipping container really a revolution? Or was this just a case of a brief sprint in what has otherwise been a marathon race? Does any one person really deserve the right to claim to invent the shipping container or the modern shipping system? It's a good question. But I think that the answer I've already shown, and that is there are countless videos and articles seen by millions in the modern day about Malcolm McLean and his great invention that changed the world. Whereas you're hearing and learning about the relatively forgotten Lethem D. Smith and his Safeway shipping container on a Thursday night at a speaker series event at a very nice but relatively small maritime museum. So maybe there's something to getting your due. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and thank you for watching. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer some questions if you have any, and I will also take us into the shipping container. You can obviously see it here at the Door County Maritime Museum, but there's some details I can point out, as well as just kind of give you a little behind the scenes look at it. So we'll go from there. Thank you. Questions?
All right. Does anybody? Hold on, let me close the PowerPoint here. There we go. Does anybody have any questions for us? If you do, type them into the chat. I got people that can wait a minute. Okay. Rhys, I think we're just, oh, here we go. Where did you find this container, Rhys?
So this container is actually the original prototype of the Lethem D. Smith Shipbuilding Company Safeway Container Division. So this never saw commercial use, this one, and it was really just kind of a leftover, and it made its way into the museum collection very, very early, before this building was even built. It was, I believe it came into the possession of, it was either John Rowan, who at the time was running Rowan Steamship Company, or C. Ray Christensen, who at a very early stage in our museum was actually, I believe, is the director for a short period of time. And of course, he was involved with not only building the container program here, but was that former head of Christie Corp, as I mentioned before. And in fact, interestingly enough, Christie Corporation would take on a lot of the dockyard space and some of the contracts of the Lethem D. Smith Corporation after it kind of crumbled in. But nothing quite hit that same height. And so this came in, as I said, relatively early. It was originally located outside in the rain and all that good stuff at the old Rolling Steamship office, which used to be our old museum. Until we built this building in 1997, opened it to the public, at which point it was brought in and put here. And it's a very, very large object that I'm not sure we're able to move around that much anymore. So
let's see. Anybody else have any questions? If not, we'll give a kind of a little walkthrough of the container. All right, Rhys, tour time. We're going to try this and see how this goes. I can't see the screen, so let me know.
all right, let's see here.
I'll hold it. You go.
Oh, okay, sure. So right here, I'm going to go ahead and actually do a quick exterior. I talked about stacking. And this was actually a very, very, very important part of the whole viability of a shipping container. Because if you can only transport things horizontally, then you're not going to be able to ship enough cargo to justify your cost. And so the method that Lethem D. Smith and his crew had developed was that they would actually have an interlocking system. And you have this kind of corner right here with its davit, and you see this little connecting point right here. That connecting point allowed to be lifted up, but then also can be locked into place because the legs would fit within perfectly. There's a lock mechanism right behind there. Again, the shape was selected because that way it could be loaded up on the standardized rail cars at the time, the rail beds. And so what you'd be able to do is you'd be able to have two of these right next to each other, and that would form about the length of a standardized rail car, at least for New York, the New York Railroad Company at the time. Double-sided doors, so we had double open doors, allowed you full access to it. This kind of dimension is relatively still used today. Right here, they don't really stand up, but this is where you'd have your serial number and your placard. It's such a minor thing, but before this, tracking what was where and who owned it was a nightmare. You can imagine if you're a ship and you're hauling, a collection of different goods for multiple companies, it'd be very easy to confuse a bunch of barrels here with sacks of grains there with a bunch of barrels there. And so this was just a very simple way to put that placard in, you serialize it, and that's a very important part of the whole standardization process of commercial shipping. Again, it had this rigid frame. The model, so there was two kinds of models that were built. There was the rigids, and then there was the collapsibles. I believe this was a rigid because it was that original design, and it's harder to tell. And it's hard to tell just off the face of it, because when it was put into this museum, or at least some stage, they actually welded. They point welded a lot of the points here. So for instance, I can't open this door, that's welded. Everywhere that would have been a collapsible section has been welded. So it's very difficult to tell whether it was a collapsible or a rigid, but I'm fairly confident it was a rigid because again, it was that prototype. So simple latch system. Again, right here, it's, we think about it today as being so simple that it's idiot proof, right? Why wouldn't you just have a door that you could close and lock? Well, we did it for the thousands of years. We did not have that. And so one of the biggest losses for any commercial shipping venture was people just stealing stuff. There's nothing to, it was a very common crime. There's nothing to do. I mean, even the longshoremen themselves might do it, or sailors could easily just, you're shipping some rum. Oh, there goes one or two bottles. Oh, fell off the side of the ship. This actually is just the ability to seal it and lock it is very important. And what that meant is that even the ship that was transporting it didn't have access. It was sealed at the point of who was shipping the goods. So they come in, they load it up, they lock it up, they put their number in. That's it. The ship can't open it up. Nobody else can open it up unless you got a pair of bolt cutters. what else for the exterior here? You know, we got this double frame door. What I find really interesting is that the current shipping containers that you see today, they all use like that corrugated steel kind of reinforcing structure, and that's right here as well. So very visually, if this was just longer, you would not be able to tell any difference between this and a modern shipping container unless you're a shipping container nerd. If you exist, good for you. So we'll go ahead and we'll dip in here very quick. And we'll point out a few more things. And I'm gonna actually sit down because I've been standing all day.
Hold on, I'm futzing with the thing. Bigger.
All right. So, you know, within this frame, as you can see, I can stand up. That's important. You need to be able to move things in and out. It gives any number of workers the ability to actually load up very quickly. And then also the height mattered too because of the stability of the unit. The taller a unit is, the more wobbly it can get. Now, current rectangular shipping containers solve that by just having a wider footprint. But in this case, having that square footprint still works. It was found to be very seaworthy. So if you want to come in here quick, I don't know how far you can get in. So even though this was a rigid hull shape, it was still built to the same standards. Even though it was a rigid hull shape, it was built to the same standards as a collapsible one. And the idea that this panel would be able to collapse in on itself. And you can kind of see that with the different kind of structural, actually holding things here. I forget what you'd call that, but these would allow you to actually secure it up, give a little bit of extra strength, and so forth. Unfortunately, our container here has seen some better days. We got a little bit of rust. That's just to be kind of expected. We're gonna give it a touch up here soon. But kind of looking at that collapsible nature, then this is a separate piece. This is a separate piece. That's a separate piece. The top bracket would actually, when it collapsed in on itself, would close down, and so you would have a container that, when fully assembled, would be 7.5 feet tall, but when collapsed, would only be a couple feet tall. And so that allowed you to load up multiple of these on a single train car. I believe the news article I'd mentioned, or that I'd shown in my presentation, where they were sending out the first shipment, they had, I believe, 22 of these on that one simple train rail car. And then they had 5 fully assembled ones, as well as 2 cranes. That's a lot of containers to ship out. And now this is something that really hadn't been done before. So it's so simple, but a lot of thought goes into every single stage of the process. And I think that's what makes it so impressive. We take this stuff for granted now, but again, at one point, it used to be people would just try to stuff this up as best as it could into holds. Items would have to be hand carried on, or they'd have simple net cranes that would bring it on. The use of pallets and loading things on pallets, that was also very, very recent. That didn't see any kind of real wide-scale adoption until World War II. So I think this is just kind of a cool unit. And so if there's any more questions, either related to this construction, now mind you, I'm not an engineering expert. This is just what I've kind of gathered through my own research for our museum. But I'll try my best to answer questions you might have.
Can anybody spend the night in this one?
Well, hey, if you want to make $1 million donation to our museum, I'll put out a cot for you. No, we don't currently allow sleeping in the shipping container. But as I said, who knows? Maybe sometime in the future when we get this, maybe a fresh coat of paint or something in here, we might revisit the idea.
How tall are you in the container?
I am 5'11". So the interior height of this is about just under 6 inches. Or no, I'm sorry. It's just about 6 feet, maybe a few over. And so again, for a full-grown man, and mind you, back 70 years ago, people on average were a little shorter, especially, your stevedores that might have been working in other ports, they'd come up to here, right? So plenty of room. Now, if you're, I don't know, one of our many Swedish ancestors that live out in the county, you might have to duck a little, but well, I'm sure you'd be able to squeeze in all right.
You have any thoughts about the shipping containers that are floating around in the ocean?
So are we talking about shipping containers that are on ships or shipping containers that are not on ships?
I'm thinking not on ships, like loose.
Well, so shipping containers.
Do they float? Are they sealed?
So they're sealed, but they're not necessarily 100% airtight. They're going to leak, they're going to sink, or their contents are going to burst open, and it's going to. There was a very, very famous, and I'm forgetting the exact date and the name of the ship, but there was an incident where a ship had a shipping container or a few shipping containers loaded full of rubber ducks that fell off into the ocean and splayed out their entire contents. And so for the longest time, people were finding rubber ducks, and it was actually transformed into a very interesting survey about ocean currents. And so for a while, as people were finding these ducks, you had the ability to kind of search in and say where you found your duck. And then they'd be able to figure out roughly how they kind of went. And that very wasteful and polluting act actually helped us develop a lot of insight into the way that ocean currents work, because these rubber ducks were lining up everywhere. They were going everywhere, but they also showed patterns where they would go. So that's just a side thing for that. Now, this also highlights one issue when it comes to containerization and the expansion of container trade. Containerization made things very, very cheap to ship. There's a reason, and that has multiple consequences. For instance, in the 1970s and 80s, a lot of companies were finding it was a lot easier and cheaper just to ship things from, say, China than it was to manufacture in the United States, because they had containers and a very simple, very cheap system to transport. Before that, it was cost prohibitive. Why would you ship something from China or Japan or the Philippines or anywhere like that if it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to ship it? And then there's also the chance it's going to get lost. And so that is one effect, has been it reshaped the way that the world economy worked. Second is that because we've been able to transport all these goods in these containers, we now produce so much more and we ship so much more. And that has an environmental cost as well. You think of the amount of shipping that occurs. So there's an economic benefit and there's an economic cost. And the same goes with that. And finally, we've become very, very, and this is very, very topical today, but because of how interconnected we are all now, because in large part because of the shipping container, well, what happens when one ship decides to, I don't know, have one few too many and go sideways in the Suez Canal? Well, that caused a lot of issues. And so it requires complete reshaping and updating of infrastructure. So yeah, the container ship, and this is way segue off of what your original question, but the impacts, both economic and environmental, well, they're resounding.
All right, Rhys, let's take one more question and then we'll wrap it up. Sure. The weight of this empty box, and was or is aluminum ever considered?
So yes, aluminum was considered as a material for use in the shipping container industry. It's even used now, but this one is made of steel, and there was plans to incorporate aluminum. Aluminum prior to World War II, before that, was actually pretty prohibitively expensive. It was rationed and saved primarily for airplane manufacturing. Now, with the war summing up that led to a kind of a glut of supplies. But even then, steel was at the time cheaper than aluminum. But yeah, no, there were plans to try to transition to aluminum core, and that was within the documentation. But they didn't get the chance because Safeway container system pretty much just ceased to be, as I said, in 1946. And that's a shame, because we might be, instead of talking about, this could have possibly been the design. Sturgeon Bay could have very well been the commercial container shipping hub for this manufacturer. And it's also interesting too, because Latham B. Smith had some ideas. He wanted to expand container shipping on the Great Lakes. He had a worldview, but a local focus. And so he wanted to see these being used to transport things from Green Bay and Sturgeon Bay and Milwaukee all around. And that's not really the reality that we have today. We still transport things primarily by rail, in and out, unless it's bulk. For a while, we did have the car ferries, which would transport rail cars and physical cars, but even those have kind of largely been regulated to the dustbin of history now. So, lost opportunities of what could have been.
How heavy is this thing? Do we know?
Oh, yes, I have it in my notes, but I don't have it off the tip of my tongue. I'm sorry. But what we'll do is, I'm sure that our master of ceremonies here, Paige, will send you a quick message after this conversation is done with the way. I'll tell it to her.
All right. I think that's it. Sorry, Joel. We'll let you know when we look through Rhys's notes. All right. All right, everybody. Sign off.
Thanks for tuning in, and hope to see you at the museum sometime.
May 6th, next speaker series, Heroes on Deck. Join us.